descendant, the Conway cabal of disgruntled officers and politicians unsuccessfully schemed to out Washington and appoint Gates. How well that would have worked can be seen when Gates was sent to command American troops in the South. His poor tactical decisions resulted in his army being routed by a smaller force of redcoats and loyalists at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina in 1780. Washington also suffered his share of defeats. But his persistence and inspiration kept the Continental Army in the field through the worst of times, which is why his face is on the $1 bill. If Gates had been in command, we might be paying for our groceries with shillings and pence. The American Civil War was a factory for producing bad generals such as Braxton Bragg and Ambrose Burnside. But the worst of all was McClellan, the so-called young Napoleon from whom Lincoln and the Union expected great things. McClellan was a superb organizer, a West Point-trained engineer who did much to build the Union Army almost from scratch. But he was overly cautious by nature. Despite Lincoln's pleas for aggressive action, his Army of the Potomac moved hesitantly. Its commander McClellan convinced himself that the Southern armies vastly outnumbered him when logic should have told him that it was the North that enjoyed an abundance of resources. Men and material the Union could provide its armies. But there was something that not even the factories of New York and Chicago could produce, and that was time. As Lincoln well knew, the only way the Union could lose the war was if the North eventually grew tired and agreed to allow the South to secede. Haste risked casualties and defeats at the hands of a formidable opponent like Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia. The alternative was to split the United States asunder. Ulysses S. Grant, who replaced McClellan, understood this. He gritted his teeth and wore down the Confederacy with incessant attacks until the South could take no more. McClellan was a proto-Douglas MacArthur who badmouthed his president and commander-in-chief. Grant left politics to the politicians and did what had to be done. Had Lincoln retained McClellan in command of the Union armies, many former Americans might still be whistling Dixie. When the Germans shattered his troops and his reputation at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in early 1943, Ferdinand was only a major general and a corps commander. If there was a saving grace for America, it was that he wasn't commanding an army. Not that Ferdinand didn't have real issues that would have tried any commander. Woefully inexperienced U.S. soldiers found themselves against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps veterans. The Americans lacked sufficient troops, supplies and air cover. When was the last time an American general had to fight a battle while being pounded by enemy bombers? Yet Ferdinand's solution was to order an army engineer company to build a giant bunker 100 miles from the front lines. He also issued orders to his troops in a personal code that no one else understood, such as this gem of command clarity. The Kasserine disaster had repercussions. It was a humiliating baptism of fire for the U.S. Army in Europe, and more important, caused British commanders to dismiss their Yank allies as amateur soldiers for the rest of the war. Listing MacArthur as one of America's worst generals will be controversial. But then MacArthur thrived on controversy like bread thrives on yeast. He was indeed a capable warrior, as shown by the South Pacific Campaign and the Incheon landing in Korea. But he also displayed remarkably bad judgment, as when he was commander in the Philippines in 1941. Informed that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor and were certain to attack the Philippines next, MacArthur failed to disperse his aircraft, the only force that could disrupt the Japanese offensive in the absence of the American fleet, and to attack Japanese airfields before the enemy wiped out his air force. But his crowning achievement was bad generalship in Korea. Yes, the landing at Incheon unhinged the initial North Korean offensive. But the rash advance into North Korea was a blunder of strategic proportions. Advancing in dispersed columns across the northern half of the peninsula was an invitation to be destroyed piecemeal. Advancing to the North Korean border with China also was a red flag for Mao Zedong, who feared that American troops on his border were a prelude to U.S. invasion. I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was, but that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to three-quarters of them would be in jail. The early days of the 2003 Iraq War were bound to be a graveyard for military and political